What is up, my fellow Shield Brothers? Shield Brother 6 here with another episode of A Day in the Life. Today we're talking about the armament of the Normans and the Norman invasion. So with that, let's get started for today. The Norman invasion. The army of William of Normandy, also known as William the Conqueror, landed at Pevensey on 28th of the September of 1066. And that's roughly the time period we're going to be talking about with the armament around 1066 and the Norman invasion and what they used. His army was a well-equipped fighting force composed of hardened and well-trained soldiers. The size of the Norman fleet and the army it carried has been widely debated by for scholars for many years. William of Jumiges tells us that the fleet numbered around 3,000 ships, while the 12th century chronicler Wace gives a much lower number of about 696. A 12th century document, known as the Ship List of William the Conqueror, apparently written between 1130 and 1160, is believed to be a copy of an older document possibly written as early as 1067, which gives a detailed list of the ship's supplies, etc. Men such as the Duke's half-brother Robert of Mortain and the Bishop of Odo of Bayeux, William Fitz-Osbern and the Bishop of Le Mans are also mentioned as owning a specific number of ships. This list sets the total owed by William's subjects as 1,000, and when we consider the possibility that the Duke's other allies supplied other ships, it is probably and very fairly large, like anywhere around 1,000 upwards, because there's just so many allies as well as people loyal to William the Conqueror. And then that puts his men at around 60,000, but most modern historians have discounted such large numbers and generally agree upon a figure of about 7,000 men, which is much smaller than originally thought. Whatever these numbers may be, there is one thing for sure: Duke William of Normandy was an astute military commander with a successful history. He knew his opponent and his resources available to him outstandingly. As William does not seem to have been a man prone to rash and impetuous action, we can assume that he assembled a force large enough to have some assurance of success. The fact that he was able to assemble such a large invasion force and hold it together at such a time in history in an encampment for an extended period of time, it is a testament to his dynamic leadership qualities and organizational skills and leadership. So, William the Conqueror, the validity of William's claim to the English throne has been hotly debated, and undoubtedly this trend will continue until the end of time, because we're just unable to know what the actual claim was due to his relations. Earl Harold Godwinson assumed the English throne on the 6th of June, the day after Edward the Confessor's death. This ascension was not automatic. Even though Harold claimed that he had been named as the old king's successor, his appointment still required the approval of the Anglo-Saxon Witan or Great Council. This seems to be readily granted, as strong anti-Norman sentiments had taken control since the Godwins returned from exile, because they did not want someone such as William the Conqueror to Normanize Britain. Although, undoubtedly, they were unable to stop the Norman force. William the Conqueror himself was such an astute leader. He had such a vast variety of skills. He had leadership, swordsmanship, and then just the charisma with his men. He also was very good with economics and maintaining and sustaining his force. So it is not surprising to see that someone such as William the Conqueror would lead such a well battle-hardened and armed force such as the Norman invasion to success across the British Isles. So let's talk about the armament now. First off, we got to address the knight, because the knight was such a important part of the Norman force in the invasion of England and especially Ireland. The knights, armored warriors fighting on horseback with lance, sword, and shield, were the Normans' secret weapon, especially at the Battle of Hastings. Nothing like them had ever been seen in England before, for though the Saxons did ride to battle or on journeys, they always fought on foot, unlike the Normans. There were between 1,000 and 2,000 knights just alone in the Norman army, and it was these who mainly won William's victory. Norman knights were trained from childhood to fight on horseback. Known as destriers, and often with stallions, their war horses were bred to carry armored men. These fierce horses also fought for themselves, biting opponents, lashing out with their hooves, and stomping men when needed. The 1066 Norman army included many groups of knights who were used to fight side by side under the same leaders. So they stuck together when doing difficult things like pretending to flee, fake maneuvers, etc., such as a fake route, etc., but then turning and cutting down the Saxon pursuers. Both Anglo-Saxon and Normans also used very similar swords at the Battle of Hastings. There were a simple design with a crossguard to protect the hand and a broad two-edged blade with a shallow point. But they varied greatly in quality due to the type of iron available, and the plain iron-bladed swords used by poorer warriors compared to the finely made steel-bladed weapons treasured by greater men. These were passed down in families and were often given names such as the Viking King swords were called, things such as Legbiter, etc. Those were the nice steel swords owned by the knights and lords, whereas the common man would be using a iron-bladed sword. So the 1066 swords were used mostly for slashing and then for thrusting. A really good sword could cut through a shield or even armor, such as the Bayeux Tapestry. A Norman knight is shown slicing off the head of a Saxon battle axe with his sword. That just shows how these steel swords were so much better than the iron sword. So not only were they out-trained, but the Saxons and the Irish were also out-armored and out-armed. There was also the wooden mace or club. The wooden clubs, perhaps often studded with iron nails, were cheap weapons that everyone could afford. But in the Bayeux Tapestry, both William the Conqueror himself and his half-brother Odo of Bayeux were also shown carrying club-like maces, perhaps a badge of rank. Maces were used for hitting enemies over the head and could also be thrown, and the spikes would impale the man. At the Battle of Hastings, the most feared Anglo-Saxon warriors were King Harold's housecarls, his private army of highly trained professional fighters and bodyguards. These were the most fine soldiers in all of Europe at the time, and their favorite weapon was the Dane axe, the long-handed battle axe. And it gets the Dane axe because, as we know due to my other videos, they had originated from the Vikings of the Danish area. Swung with two hands, the battle axe was capable of cutting off the head of a man or a horse with one blow, but it was also light and well balanced enough to be used with one hand while the other hand held a shield if needed. So the battle axe was such a dynamic weapon, especially when used by well-trained men such as housecarls. You can just see how these Anglo-Saxon high guard would come in with their Dane axe and just hack through an opposing army. And then of course there's the bow. Many Norman archers are shown in the Bayeux Tapestry, and it is estimated that there were over 1,000 of them in William's army. They played an important part in the Battle of Hastings, especially after William ordered them to shoot high, firing their arrows into the heads of the Saxons behind the shield wall. Archers needed to move quickly, so they were lightly clothed and sometimes barefoot and bare-legged. Some of them are shown with their arrows and quivers attached to their belts, while others take theirs from bigger quivers placed in the ground. Though none are shown in the tapestry, the Norman army also included crossbowmen. Crossbows, a relatively new kind of weapon in 1066 for the West, shot much more slowly than ordinary bows, but their bolts could penetrate right through shields and into a man. Only one Anglo-Saxon archer is shown in the tapestry at all, symbolizing that Harold's army included very few bowmen. Archers were very poor men, and possibly they couldn't afford horses to help them keep up with Harold's rapid movement in the battlefield. Used by both sides at Hastings, the iron-headed spear was the poorer warrior's weapon, but used by most everyone. Everyone knew how to use a spear or a javelin. It could be used for thrusting or thrown like a javelin, and in the Bayeux Tapestry, some Saxons are shown holding bundles of spears ready for throwing. The spear is such an iconic weapon, especially for this age. The lance. Close to the spear and often related, most Norman knights carried long spears called lances. These could be tucked under their armpit like a later jousting lance, but are more often shown being held in the right hand and wielded over arm. Knights used them to thrust through gaps in the Saxon shield wall or spear fleeing enemies, and they could also be thrown. Several different types of spears were used, as well as the shield. Several different shields shapes are shown at the Bayeux Tapestry. The long kite-shaped shield was a very typical armament of the Norman knights, but also carried by Norman foot soldiers, and it protected the whole body. It could be slung around the neck and on the strap, or carried on the left forearm when riding, leaving the left hand free for the reins. It also had hand grips to hold it when fighting on foot. Some Saxons, especially the housecarls, also defended themselves with kite-shaped shields, but others used stronger and heavier wooden round shields. But both types could be interlocked together to form a shield wall or a shield castle. Round shields had spiked metal bosses in the middle, so they could be used as weapons to injure an enemy or push them off balance, making the shield a deadly weapon as well as a defensive instrument. And I love the kite-shaped shield because it's so iconic for the Norman conquest of England, and it's just so beautiful in its use in this type of era. The Norman victory. The Norman conquest of England in Britain, also called the Norman conquest of the conquest, was the 11th century invasion and occupation of England by an army of Norman, Briton, and French soldiers led by Duke William II, later styled himself William the Conqueror, that would revolutionize and change Britain's history forever. William's claim to the English throne derived from his familial relationship with the childless Anglo-Saxon king Edward the Confessor, who may have encouraged William's hopes for the throne. Edward died in January of 1066 and was succeeded by his brother-in-law Harold Godwinson. The Norwegian king Harold Hardrada invaded northern England in September of 1066 and was victorious at the Battle of Fulford, but Harold defeated and killed him in the Battle of Stamford Bridge at 25th of September. Within days, William landed in southern England. Harold marched south to confront him, leaving a significant portion of his army in the north. Harold's army confronted William invaders on the 14th of October at the Battle of Hastings, which obviously is very important. William's force defeated Harold, who was also killed in the engagement. Although William's main rivals were gone, he still faced rebellions over the following years, and was not secure on his throne until around 1072-1073. The lands of the resisting English elite were confiscated. Some of the elite fled into exile. This control of his new kingdom solidified. William granted lands to his followers and built castles commanding military strongpoints throughout the land. Other effects of the conquest include the court and the government, the introduction of the Norman language as the language of the elites, which was a French language, which is why the English kings would speak French for hundreds of years to come, and why it was just so important and so groundbreaking and earth-shattering for the English peoples when the Norman victory over the British Isles. And with this language thrust upon them and changes in the composition of the upper classes, as William encompassed lands to be held directly from the king, more gradual changes affected the agricultural classes and village life. The main change appears to have been the formal elimination of slavery. There was no more serfdom allowed in the English Isles, which may or may not have been linked to the invasion. There was also little alteration in the structure of the government, as the new Norman administrators took over many of the forms of Anglo-Saxon government, merely just integrating into it. Well, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, go ahead and leave me a like. If you did not, you can leave me a dislike. I hope you learned something about the Norman invasion. I hope you learned about their armament, and I hope you enjoyed. And if you would like to leave me a comment, suggestion, or concern, you can do that down for me in the comment section. And as always, this has been Shield Brother 6 with your weekly dose of history, with your another day in the life. And as always, I'll catch you next time.